Hey guys, Brad here from Scooter Street. I wanted to do a video today on this Malossi MHR Team 2 inner rotor ignition. This one I've got here is actually for an SR50R. It's for a scooter that we recently tuned in the shop. I'm going to have a video on that one coming out soon. But this bike in particular has a really high revving cylinder kit, has an MHR racing cylinder kit. So we've done a video before on the MVT inner rotor ignition where I discussed quite a bit around some of the advantages of an inner rotor ignition. But we didn't really do one, didn't really discuss too much on when it is that you really need the inner rotor ignition. So I'm going to pop this one out of the box and we'll have a look at go through the parts that come in the kit because it is a really great kit. And then we'll discuss a little bit further the times and instances in which you would realistically need an inner rotor ignition on your scooter. First things first, let's get this puppy out of the box. So we'll admit I've had a bit of a sneaky peek at this already, because I just couldn't wait to get my hands on it. So, as I mentioned, this is the kit for the SR50R. It's actually the kit for all the liquid-cooled Piaggio engines. They do an almost identical kit for the air-cooled Piaggio engine. The only difference is, obviously, an air-cooled scooter has a fan which regularly bolts to the flywheel. So this little balance plate here, which Malossi provide with the inner rotor kit, for the SR50R being liquid-cooled, there's no additional mountings for the fan. Whereas if you were to purchase the kit for the air-cooled engine, it has the fittings for the fan to bolt onto the outside of it. And I believe in that kit that this plate's actually slightly lighter as well. So this plate, got our little mounting plate here as well. So this obviously mounts to the actual crankcase. And then you have your additional mounting plate here, which has the long slide so it's adjustable. So you can set it up for your particular scooter. Now I had a Malossi Team inner rotor ignition on one of my previous SR50s. It's going back a couple of years. This one here is the brand new one. And if you're familiar with Malossi inner rotor ignitions, you've seen them before, you'd see straight away this new unit is really compact. It's a lot smaller than the previous model, and it's really quite nice. It's very lightweight as well. And the new plugs they've got here, these little waterproof plugs, are a really great idea. Obviously, as you'd know, if you have a Piaggio or if you've seen some of my videos before, the Piaggio engine does have a really common failure of the stator plug. So, not that you're using it with this anyway, but a nice, good waterproof plug, which is going to be really easy to, if you're doing servicing, unplugging it, that sort of thing, it's going to be a big advantage over the factory plug. This is the actual flywheel itself, which that's where the inner rotor gets its name. It actually rotates on the inside rather than the outside. This coil here is exactly the same coil that comes if you buy the Malossi TC unit for the Piaggio engine. The factory Piaggio CDI, if you've looked at one before, is the all-in-one unit CDI and coil. So when Malossi do the inner rotor kit as well as the TC unit, they split the coil up, so it comes as a separate unit, but uses the same mounting point, so it's really easy to fit. Typical for Malossi, all the bolts and screws and washers are all included in the kit. Some more wires, nice little rubber grommet there for mounting, as well as some little brass tubes for mounting. And this is one of the great things about the new kit that I noticed immediately compared to my previous one that I bought. On the last one that I bought, I had to buy this CDI separately. This is the adjustable Digitronic CDI. It didn't come with the inner rotor. Now it comes with it. The great thing about this CDI, it includes, it has a really high level of adjustability by these neat little dials here. I've had a pretty good read through these instructions just to see primarily what the major differences are between this new Team 2 and the previous model. I'll get to that in a moment. Now, when you're setting these up, generally the rule is you set the mechanical parts, as in the actual physical parts of the inner rotor, according to top dead center of the piston. So that's what these slots are for. Getting the inner rotor installed according to top dead center in the piston. That's what these markers are here for as well, which you see in the instructions when you read them. But basically, as you install it, you need to get the piston to top dead center. This is where the piston is at the absolute maximum point, and the cod rod is basically straight, completely straight, pointing upwards towards the piston, and you set your timing from there. Now, you can actually get like a depth gauge type tool that goes in through the spark plug hole and actually measures how close the piston gets to the head, which will help you set exactly or as close as possible to top dead center. Obviously, you can't see through the crank casing, so it's very difficult to get it perfect. Now, if you don't have one of these tools, from experience before, you can actually get it close enough. Obviously, more accurate is better, but you can get it close enough by removing the head and physically inspecting the piston yourself and trying to get it as close as possible. Now, Malossi have actually added sort of a bit of a redundancy, although it is a manual adjustment to this Digitronic unit, which I'll discuss in a moment. So once you've installed that component of the bike, you're going to continue to go through the instructions as all your parts are wired together. Then we're going to get to physically how we tune the electronic part of this setup, which is relatively complex. Unfortunately, if you've not done this before, although it is complex in terms of what the system is doing, it is actually fairly simple to set. So there's 3 dials on the actual Digitronic unit: limiter, offset, and maps. So you start with the limiter. Now this is basically just a rev limiter, which is adjustable. So it starts off with 0, which you see here, sets the rev limiter to 11,500 RPM. Now each click as you go up through 1 through to 9 and then A through to E, each incremental adjustment in a clockwise direction increases that rev limiter by 200 RPM, all the way up to the maximum rev limit of 14,300. Now, when you click from E to F, it removes the rev limiter completely. So really cool system. Basically, this is just to attempt to limit the absolute maximum RPM of the engine to give you a little more longevity of the piston to try to avoid engine damage. Now, if you're riding on the road, I'd probably recommend using this, especially if you're really wringing the neck out of the bike. So you might be taking it out on some fun rides on the weekend or that sort of thing, doing some extended periods of high RPM. It's probably a good idea because, say for instance, using that E setting, 14,300 RPM, that is an immense amount of RPM, particularly if you're installing this on an air-cooled scooter, which doesn't have as great an ability to dissipate heat in the cylinder and the piston compared to a liquid-cooled scooter. It's really where this will really come in handy. Moving over to the next setting, I mentioned getting the timing correct when you install the actual componentry according to Top Dead Center. Now, Malossi have thought of this, and as a little bit of a redundancy, they've actually added a manual adjustment so that you can essentially correct for any for a little bit of an incorrect setting. So say, for instance, they talk about degrees, and you see those little dials on the side of the mounting here. So in the rotation of the engine, there's obviously 360 degrees as the engine rotates all the way around. Now, this here, advanced timing usually goes in degrees as well, so it'll be a certain number of degree advanced or retarded timing. And this is just a way of measuring how much, putting a quantity on the timing itself. So this here essentially allows you to adjust the timing by a couple of degrees, plus or minus, if you think that you've maybe gotten it wrong. Now, usually if you're really pushing the bike to the limit, you'll feel that you've gotten the timing slightly wrong, and so you can go through these adjustments and adjust slightly to see how it affects the feeling of the bike. If you read through the instructions, Malossi does explain a little bit better than I have just now of how to go ahead and correct this. But that's exactly what this is for, correcting for perhaps an incorrect setting when you've actually installed the componentry. Now, coming over to the trimmer maps, this is where things start to get really impressive and you start to see how incredibly detail-orientated Malossi are. So you've got 7 different mapping modes from 0 all the way through to 7. And Malossi give you a little chart here of what the primary application of each mapping mode is for. So obviously Tempi just means stroke in Italian, so just a 2-stroke 70, 2-stroke 70, new 1, new 2, and then we come up to the 94cc, which is referring to the Malossi Testarossa 94cc, which they make, which I'm very envious of you if you have one of those. So obviously if you have a 70, you're going to be using one of these, and if you have a 94cc, you're going to be using one of these. Malossi do make a number of different Inter-Rotor kits, including ones for 4-stroke scooters, which is what item 7 is going to be for Tempi, just meaning 4-stroke. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, how much difference does the mapping mode actually make? Well, in the front of the book, Malossi give you this really cool chart. Hopefully you can see that. You can actually access these instructions via the Malossi website, but here you have a corresponding line chart with the degree advance according to the RPM. So what this CDI does, obviously it can tell how many RPM the scooter is doing, And so at these particular RPM, from 0,000 increments all the way up to 15,000, the CDI will actually adjust the level of ignition advanced timing depending on the RPM of the scooter at the time. So particularly when you see there's obviously a lot of consistency between the different maps coming up to around that 8,000 RPM. That's where things start to really become a little bit more complicated. Now around these 12,000 to sort of 14,000 RPM, you see these maps are really all over the shop. And they are pretty close, realistically, but each of these little differences in the mapping is where Malossi have assessed that different cylinders will perform differently at different levels of advanced timing. So you see, obviously, they're really raking up the advanced timing as it comes up to around that 8 to 9,000 RPM. Then it starts to back the advanced timing off. We've spoken a little bit about advanced timing before, not too in depth, but advanced timing does have the potential to create more power, but it does get to a point as well, if you go too far, where you start to overheat things and melt things and create big problems. So each of these little different values, Malossi have tested different mapping modes with different cylinders and found that there's obviously a performance advantage or a longevity of the engine advantage to each of these little changes and each of these maps. It's very, very detail orientated. Honestly, it's incredibly impressive. So what you need to do when you're installing this cylinder kit is refer back to our little chart from earlier, near the back of the book here, so you get a base idea of what sort of setting you're going to be on. Now, Malossi, again, very impressively, do put a chart in the back of the book with a bunch of their cylinder kits with corresponding settings that they recommend for advanced timing. Some other information about each of these kits. It doesn't have all the kits. In fact, the cylinder kit that we've installed on the SR50 that this in-rotor kit is going to be going on, unfortunately isn't listed in this. However, this is just a guide. So you see most of these between 16 and 17 degrees advance anyway. There's not a huge amount of variation. So what I'm going to do when I install this kit is refer to this table here and probably start off around mapping mode 1. Now, with a liquid-cooled scooter, you have a little bit more leeway because it's pretty hard to seize a liquid-cooled scooter provided the jet is right. So I'm going to start off with number 1, and I might test through 2 and 3 just to see how they each feel. We're talking, because these are racing parts, so we're talking not drastic differences. It's not going to be like the difference between a 50 and a 70 or something outrageous like that. But it's a bunch of sort of little 1% and 2% things here and there that Malossi are really looking for when they design these parts, because these are sort of high-end racing parts. So really, really beautiful quality kit, and it is nice and very encouraging to see kits like this from Malossi, where you have a brand that really, really puts a lot of great detail into designing these parts and trying to make it as easy as possible for you to fit these parts to your scooter and have some adjustability there to get it running really well. So I really highly recommend this kit. One thing I will mention about this kit, and this is really important, is this kit completely bypasses the electrical system of your scooter. So once you install this kit, it has no connectivity to the loom of the scooter, and it does not provide any charge whatsoever to your battery, and it does not provide any charge to your lighting. We spoke a little bit about this in the MVT video, MVT ignition, which has a lighting coil, in-rotor ignition with a lighting coil, so it's a little bit chunkier because it has an additional coil to provide some charge to the lighting. On most two-stroke 50cc scooters, you have two electrical systems which are interacting with the stator on top of the power which is going to the coil to run the engine. So you have your lighting system, and then you have your battery charge system. So the way you distinguish between the difference of these is turn your key on without running the engine. Anything that works, like brake lights, your dash, just general items like obviously your starter motor. These items are linked to the battery. Any items which then engage once the engine has started are linked to the lighting coil. So this is like usually your on most 50cc two-strokes, your dash light, your headlights, and your tail light, not your brake light, your tail light. So these will all not work once this has been installed. There are ways around this. On this particular bike, this SR50, because it's being used as a street bike, not a race bike, I'm going to be running some sort of custom wiring It won't be too complicated. I'm going to try and utilize the factory wiring as much as possible. But it's going to be running some wiring to those systems which usually require the lighting coil on the factory ignition to work. All the other systems will work as normal because they work off the battery until the battery starts to lose charge. So normally what we'd recommend is if you're installing this on a bike that you intend to use on the road, you need to sort something out for your systems which work via the lighting coil. So for me, I'm going to just be installing an inline switch, which the customer will have to engage and disengage as required. Same as you would in a car, turning your headlights on and off. He'll have to do that. And then the rest of the systems will function as normal, provided there's enough charge in the battery to do that. So I recommended that he get a lithium battery, a bit more charge on tap, a bit more longevity of use. And then there's quite a number of good battery charge units you can get quite cheaply, which have a couple of little eyes that you permanently install on the battery with a little single plug, which you can just have a charger handy at home when you park the scooter. Just plug it in overnight so that you replenish the charge that you've used during the day. Because the battery's not running the engine, it's just running some lighting. It's not going to use a bucket load of charge, particularly if you swap out your tail light and your headlights for some LED units, which will be a little bit more conservative on the power consumption. Now, as promised, I want to talk a little bit about application. So when would you need an in-rotor ignition? Why would you need it? So this mainly comes down to one thing, and this is that racing cylinder kits are typically not good at making torque or power down low, which means that your initial acceleration can often be a little bit poor with the factory ignition. This primarily comes down to the port map in a racing cylinder kit. So we've spoken a little bit about port maps in previous videos, but I'll give you a rough rundown now. So going through, say, for instance, Malosi's range just within the Piaggio Hyper 2 engine. I picked that one because it's one of the most common, and it's what this particular in-rotor ignition fits. So they make a couple of different port maps within their cylinder range just on this engine. So starting off with, say, for instance, the Malosi Sport. This uses a standard style port map. So a port map is essentially your transfer ports on the inside of the cylinder. This is your intake ports where fresh air and fuel come into the cylinder, and then the exhaust port, which is always the largest port, and usually in most cases a single or a twin port where the exhaust gas exits the cylinder. So because it's two-stroke, this is all sort of happening at once. So porting makes a really big difference. Now, the Sport port map is very similar to a standard factory port map, just enlarged. So when you come to an MHR rep, it's sort of a little bit of a hybrid. It's called a 9-port. So it's essentially still that one large exhaust port, but it has two very small booster ports up the top. In fact, not all MHR rep cylinder kits have these little booster ports. Some of the MHR reps for some of the Honda vertical and horizontal engines don't actually have these little booster ports. It's primarily the Piaggio and the Yamaha that have these extra little ports. Now, this MHR replica 9-port tends to operate very similar in its power delivery to a standard style port map, because it's really just a slight variant of a standard style port map. Now, where we start to get sort of away from a standard port map is when you get to their racing line. This is what uses a bridge port. You might have heard me speak about a bridge port before. You might have heard the term around. A bridge port is essentially an exhaust port which is so enlarged that it requires a bridge right down the center of it to stop the piston ring from being able to escape between strokes. Now, one of the major differences, other than just overall power delivery, because a Bridgeport cylinder kit is capable of significantly more power than a more standard style port map, one of the big differences is where it makes power. So you might think, oh, why don't all manufacturers just use a Bridgeport then? Primary reason is because a Bridgeport doesn't start to make power until very high RPM because of the way that it's set up, port timing, and also just the amount of physical exhaust gas that needs to be able to exit the exhaust port to build up back pressure in the exhaust and start to make proper power, the way that a two-stroke works, which I'm not going to completely go into. But essentially, a Bridgeport port map doesn't start to make power typically until a very high RPM, and the power window is generally pretty narrow. With a more standard style port map, the power delivery window is quite wide in comparison, and it'll make power and torque in a lot lower RPM than a racing port map like a Bridgeport. So for instance, take a Malossi Sport cylinder kit. This will start to make power around the 4,500 RPM and make good torque at that RPM, all the way up to when it drops off around 9,500, 10,000 RPM, it starts to drop off a little bit. When you come to, say, an MHR racing cylinder kit, or even one of their higher cylinder kits like a Testarossa, these cylinder kits really aren't starting to make power until around that 10,000 RPM. Prior to that, they're really not making a lot at all. Now, when it comes to an interrotor ignition, it really starts to make the difference when you come to a cylinder kit that requires really high RPM to make power. Now, I went into this in a fair bit of detail in the MVT interrotor ignition video, which is really worth a watch if you haven't watched it, because it is another really cool interrotor ignition with a couple extra functions to the Malossi ignition. But the reason this is the case is because the factory flywheel is a lot heavier than an interrotor and functions virtually in an opposite style. You could more accurately call it an outer rotor. So the heavy magnetized part of the flywheel itself, which sits on the right hand side of the casing and is attached directly to the crank, is on the outside of the rotor. It operates around the stator, which places the heavy component of the flywheel far removed from the center of the crank, which puts a lot more load on the crank when it wants to rapidly change an RPM. Now, when you come to a Bridgeport cylinder kit that needs to rapidly change an RPM, say you're sitting in a complete standstill, you give the throttle a hit, for that cylinder kit to give you a good launch, it needs to be able to rapidly change an RPM from idle up to where it starts to make power around 10,000 RPM to give you a good launch. Now, at these low RPMs, where it's trying to rapidly change up to a higher RPM, the factory flywheel is putting a lot of load on the crank, which obviously is attached to the piston, and slowing the engine's ability to rapidly change an RPM down, essentially kneecapping it as it's in its weakest point, which is at low RPM. So when you put an interrotor ignition on the bike, the actual flywheel itself is the inner part, not the outer part, and it's a lot lighter, just as dead weight as well, which means that as the engine is trying to rapidly change an RPM, the flywheel is putting significantly less load on the engine as it tries to rapidly change an RPM, which is where the sort of 95% of the benefit of an interrotor ignition comes from. Now, obviously, there's a bit of benefit in the adjustability of an interrotor ignition as well, that you can adjust the advanced timing, and that the Malossi interrotor ignition in particular allows you a huge degree of control, and those mapping modes are a real key as well, in that the CDI has the ability to sort of flex the advanced timing of the ignition as it goes through different RPMs to try and get the optimum overall timing for each RPM as the scooter revs through different rev ranges. Now, the reason I wouldn't recommend installing this unit on a less than race scooter is cost benefit. Really easy. Basically, this unit is not cheap, and unless you have a race scooter, it's going to make a positive difference, but it's not going to be drastic. If you install this on, say, a street build, say you have a Malossi Sport 70 or an MHR replica, even a completely factory scooter, you're going to see a benefit, but for the cost of this unit, you would be far better to spend that money somewhere else on your scooter. Say, for instance, a better cylinder kit, transmission tuning, a better exhaust, and you're going to see more benefit from those parts than you are this part, as it's really designed at helping a race kit get the power to the road. As always, guys, thanks for watching. Really appreciate your support. Any questions that you have, please comment below. We endeavor to answer every single comment. And for any parts for your scooter, you'll find a link to our website in the description below, where you can purchase any of the parts that we've discussed in our videos, as well as this interrotor ignition.